I've gathered some fragments from across this book, Plague Theatre, published by Equus Press, which is itself a book of fragments. And I've put them in a new arrangement for this evening. I've also made some further deletions. The sun and moon were in alignment. The latrines had been emptied, and the air was bad. Too much. I should claw back a little and state more simply that when I read those words over during the first phase of study, the sea looked like liquid glass. I set myself in the shallow half of the pit and spent time warming up my vocal folds or chords, like the whites of an eye in texture and form. They dry easily when tense and in a state of vibration, is how the manuscript began. This book is largely unreadable to me now. I have left it too long and forgotten most of what I wrote and thought. An intellectual project of this scale and depth, once put aside, loses its vigor and dies in the mind of its author. I look at the book and wonder how it once preoccupied me so badly, and how something that rose to the level of an obsession could now mean so little. Intellectual oppositions, I have come to think, often tend to function as excuses not to question the material. Well, no, that is not quite right. The intellect sets itself up as some great inquiring machine, but what it does is deaden the effects of what it encounters. No, again, that is not quite right. The intellect kills itself in advance. Much better. Everyone dies fast when viewed like that. They are born, grow up, and die in the time it takes for attention to stray from one half-century to the next, 18th, 19th, and scores have lived, exploited one another, and died. The magistrate arrived in a manner that set the tone of his exorcism. His people carried him through the town gates inside the belly of a fish. The structure on which it lay was set down. Rumors of the fish spread throughout the streets filled with people, and the people crushed their way to the square. When the whole town was assembled, so far as it could, within sight or earshot, his first man climbed to the top of the creature, now baked by the sun, and held his hand out raised to signal our silence. The sound of cutting was heard by those nearest, including myself, and we looked to the belly of the thing. A knife punctured the side and worked its way up and across and down until a doorway fell, wet from the interior, and from which the Whitby magistrate emerged as if freshly born, yet old already, his face cut by the sea and the elements and the cruelty of life, with lines that declared the latitudes he crossed and the seas he beat into submission. The ocean never consumed him whole as it consumed so many like him, though it marked him with its reaches and its vastness and its depths. He raised himself up and said, "Nothing but the terror of man will do before the terrors you face as a people." His people then lined up before the mouth of the creature, which they prized apart and entered by crawling, each appearing at the opening in its side, wet with the innards and born. The sound that came from the streets and houses surpassed the worst, which is to say, the best orchestra humankind has yet assembled, or so I felt, and was met by the storm that previously cut below the cliff and caused it to fall, so that nobody heard the cattle in terror on the land that slipped to the sea, and from which they could not be retrieved, but had to be eaten in situ around fires built when the storm was past and the land had ceased to move. That storm was by now a memory, and the cattle it stranded long eaten and digested by a people that did not ordinarily eat their cattle, but exported them south, surviving instead, and for the most part, on the fish they caught and small livestock kept in yards. Lines were thrown into the waves, hauled back and thrown again. None took hold. One man lashed himself to the mast and was seen, at intervals, looking up to those on the cliff. Several onlookers were lost from the pier. The eventual fate of the boats taken to the cliff below Castle Hill could not be seen at first, due to the swell and the rain, but soon enough the sea was full of broken timber. This storm continued for 16 days, the longest in their memory. The families of the sea dead looking from their houses at the spray until the spray was gone. I was, at last, to pass them by and make my retreat to the castle. All those remaining sat on the street or leant from their windows, where the din they had given just moments before reached a volume and depth of rage it could be ingested. This sound made full and fit to rupture, for they seemed bloated with it, clutching their stomachs newly filled with stacked reverberation. I could not avoid taking some too, as it forced its way into my mouth and tasted improbably like beef. I would not allow that entry, and then its digestion. Sound does not taste or fill the stomach, but sits there heavy, laid in the place of what must fill stomachs and pass through them for organisms to live. These were the words I held to as I crawled along the street, words that were become detached or slipped to neighboring things, reattached to objects in the absurd poetry of gutted sense and signification. My body became a word, and the parts of it each spoke something to another, and parts of other bodies spoke back, or did not speak, but just said themselves as words and not to anything in particular. Words became bodies, became organs, became thought. A mind that became itself turned inward, inspected itself, and made through itself, outside itself, to think inward, outward movements against the walls, where tarred hands once left traces, and words now lent, mouth parts open, that open saying not mouth, but cannibalize your youth, eat the word, indigestible sentences, human sacrifices, feet, and so. At least this was how I remember it feeling before I closed my eyes and ears. I have come to doubt everything I have written, he wrote, and consider returning to the town. The conviction I must eat is my last remaining superstition. My diet is poor and devoid of nutriment, in that what I eat, I suspect, crawls to the surface. All order seemed mere preparation for disorder, and all human kindness preparation for ferocity. After a time, however, this perception waned, and I could not understand how what I saw in a state of peace could have been so disordered, or how what I saw in its condition of abjection had once been so well set. The one gallery we had in Scarborough was full of souls seeking escape from the streets. Only the oils ran toward the floor, and the frames burst. When the cycle turned to its beginning, and the streets returned to their former peace, or what we have given the name of peace, the gallery was visited again for pleasure and not from suffering. The oils had solidified, the frames were stable, and the paintings satisfied those who looked upon them. With no church that day appearing, the congregation had nothing to do but walk again back in its direction, always arriving elsewhere. Some at the harbour, others at the sands, still others found themselves climbing off the sands onto the island piers. Contentment amid destruction and the knowledge of destruction is not a psychological contentment, but a functional contentment. When I said our consciousness, the ability to live in the knowledge of destruction, was a psychological achievement, this was shorthand for a more basic point, that the present outlook is a functional achievement. As such, it cannot be combated by knowledge or understanding or training or conscience or education. I cannot accept we are now witness to a redeeming epidemic. I write with a mixture of soot, lamp oil, and water. For this I go at intervals to the master gunner's house, where I scrape soot from the cannons and the rafters. When they sat up, they were unable to sit, even though they felt as though they were sitting and had the strongest impression. The act of sitting was at odds with the organization of things. The merchants laughed themselves sick that night in the taverns and pissed alongside one another in the tavern latrines, still laughing at the credulity of others. The eye, he said, is an insubordinate organ and must be taught to see properly and without illusion. The spyglass is a dangerous machine. It fills the eye with visions that the eye without it cannot confirm. Once all were gathered, he had their telescopes bound together and installed a whaler's spear at the centre. When the sun broke out and the magistrate felt the need, he would climb to the roof of the highest building overlooking the square, and with its serrated point angled to the earth, gathered light with the bundle he carried and projected heat in the eyes of those below, calling it the lesson of the eyes, his truth, the authority of light.